Hello everyone, wishing you a beautiful day. Today we're stepping into a crowded spring market where a poor girl stands alone, surrounded by people. Yet no one comes to help when danger quietly closes in. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. The market had grown louder by late afternoon, but for Tieu Lac, the noise no longer felt so overwhelming. At first, every voice, every passing face, every glance in her direction had made her chest tighten. But now, after her first few sales, something inside her had softened. Her basket was lighter. The coins in her hand were still few, but they were real. Earned, warm from being counted and recounted in her palm. She stood a little straighter. The spring light slanted through the market roof and made the remaining candied strawberries shine like tiny red lanterns. Every now and then, a customer stopped. A child pointed. A mother smiled. A young man bought one and walked away chewing happily. Each sale was small, but to Tieu Lac, each one mattered. Each one pushed back the darkness just a little. For the first time that day, she let herself imagine going home with good news. Not freedom, not some miracle that would erase every burden overnight. Just enough to make her mother breathe easier. Enough to keep one more worry from turning into a fight with fate. Enough to believe tomorrow might be faced without shame. That fragile hope was still settling in her chest when she heard laughter behind her. Not the easy laughter of festival joy. This laughter was sharper. Familiar too. Tieu Lac's fingers paused over the basket before she slowly turned. A small group of girls around her age had stopped a short distance away. Their clothes were brighter than hers, their hair neatly tied, their faces full of the careless confidence that comes from not having to count every coin. She recognized them immediately. Girls from nearby. Girls who knew her name. Girls who had once studied beside her before life had split their paths apart. One of them looked her up and down, then smirked. "Well, look at this," she said lightly, though there was nothing kind in her tone. "So you really came to the market to sell candy?" Another girl giggled. Not even to enjoy the festival, just to work through it. A third leaned closer to the basket and laughed. "How sad. While everyone else is having fun, you're standing here selling strawberries like an old auntie." The girls burst into laughter again. Tieu Lac lowered her eyes to the basket, pretending to adjust the skewers. Her face remained calm, but her heartbeat changed. It was one thing to struggle in private. Another thing entirely to have your hardship turned into entertainment. She said nothing. That only seemed to encourage them. One girl crossed her arms and tilted her head. "Tell me, Tieu Lac, do you even have time to be young? Or is your whole life just debt, work, debt, work?" Another chimed in, almost teasingly. "Maybe if you smile more, people will pity you and buy faster." More laughter. Their words were not shouted. That was what made them crueler. They were delivered lightly, almost playfully, as if humiliation were just another kind of game. People nearby heard. Some glanced over. A few looked away immediately. No one said anything. Tieu Lac felt heat rise in her face, but she kept her posture steady. She had learned long ago that the poor do not have the luxury of reacting to every insult. Pride cost energy too, and energy, like money, had to be saved. So she simply said, very quietly, "If you don't want to buy, please let others pass." The softness of her voice surprised them for a moment. Then one of the girls gave a short laugh. "Listen to her. She's got spirit after all." "Spirit?" another replied. "No, she just doesn't want us scaring away her customers." They laughed once more, then finally drifted off into the crowd, still whispering, still glancing back. Tieu Lac did not watch them leave. She kept her eyes on the basket, though for a few seconds the bright red fruit blurred in front of her. Her throat tightened, but she swallowed it down. Around her, the market went on exactly as before. Music still played. Voices still called. Children still begged their mothers for sweets. The world had not changed just because her pride had been stepped on. And maybe that was what hurt the most. To everyone else, it had been nothing. Just a few girls laughing. Just one poor vendor being reminded of her place. Tieu Lac drew in a breath and lifted her head again. She adjusted the strap of her basket and called out once more, her voice softer than before, but still steady. She would not leave. She could not afford to leave. A few more customers came. Not many, but enough to force her mind back to the task at hand. She handed over candy sticks, accepted coins, thanked people politely. Little by little, the sting inside her settled into something duller, heavier. Not gone. Just buried. The sun was beginning to sink lower when the atmosphere around her shifted again. It happened in that strange way trouble sometimes announces itself before a single word is spoken. A shadow falling across the basket. A smell of cheap liquor. A pause in nearby conversation. Tieu Lac looked up and saw two young men standing in front of her. They were not much older than the girls who had mocked her, but there was something rougher in the way they carried themselves. Their clothes were untidy. Their smiles were lazy and unpleasant. One had his hands tucked into his belt. The other leaned slightly too close to the basket, eyes not really on the candy. "Well now," one of them said, stretching the words out. "What do we have here?" "Candied strawberries," the other replied with a grin. "Sweet things sold by a sweet girl." The first man laughed. Tieu Lac's hand tightened around the edge of the basket. "Do you want to buy?" she asked, keeping her tone polite. Instead of answering, one of them picked up a skewer without permission and turned it in the light. 5,000 each, right?" he said. "Yes." He nodded slowly, still smiling. "That's cheap." But he did not hand it back. His friend stepped closer. "Maybe we should take a few, since you're working so hard." Tieu Lac forced herself not to step back. "If you want them, please pay first." The men exchanged a look and chuckled, as if her answer amused them. "Pay first," one repeated. "Did you hear that?" The other bent a little closer, lowering his voice. "You sound brave for someone standing here alone." There it was. The thing she had felt the moment they arrived. This was not about candy. Around them, the market still moved, but people had begun to notice. Some slowed down. Some glanced over with that same uneasy expression people wear when trouble is close but not yet theirs. A woman holding a child looked for a second, then kept walking. An older vendor at the next stall rearranged his goods without lifting his head. A man passing by frowned, hesitated, and then moved on. No one wanted involvement, because everyone knew what kind of men these were, and everyone knew what kind of girl Tieu Lac was. Poor, alone, easy to overlook. The one holding the skewer took a bite without paying. "Not bad," he said through a grin. "Sweet." His friend laughed and reached toward the basket too. "Maybe we should sample more." Tieu Lac moved the basket back. "Please don't do that." "Or what?" one of them asked immediately. His tone changed, still quiet but flatter now. Tieu Lac said nothing. She could feel it, fear climbing up from her stomach into her chest, cold and fast. But she also knew fear was dangerous when men like this were watching for it. So she kept her face as steady as she could, even while her fingers trembled slightly against the bamboo handle. "I need to sell these," she said. "Please move." The taller one smiled without warmth. "You need a lot of things, don't you?" His eyes swept over her face, then her clothes, then the basket again. Tieu Lac wanted to disappear under that look. The second young man leaned even closer, voice low and mocking. No friends around? No brothers? No one helping you? He already knew the answer. That was why he dared ask. Tieu Lac glanced around just once. The market was full, yet somehow it felt empty around her. People were there. People saw. But their eyes slid away the moment hers met theirs. Some were afraid. Some didn't care. Some had already decided this was not worth the inconvenience. That was the terrible truth of it. When poverty wraps itself around you long enough, even your danger becomes ordinary to others. The first man set the half-eaten skewer back in the basket like a joke. "How about this?" he said. "Come walk with us for a bit, and maybe we'll buy everything." His friend laughed. "Yeah, maybe we'll be generous." Tieu Lac's breath caught. The world around her suddenly sounded distant, blurred, as though the market noise had moved behind a wall. Her heart pounded so hard it almost hurt. She wanted to step away, but one of them had shifted just enough to block the easiest path out. She looked past them, into the moving crowd, searching for one face, one voice, one sign that someone might step in. But no one did. And as the two young men smiled at her like wolves circling something cornered, Tieu Lac realized that if help was coming at all, it had not arrived yet. Tieu Lac spends the late afternoon in the spring market, slowly gaining confidence as she sells her candied strawberries. Though each sale is small, the few warm coins in her palm give her hope that she might return home with a little relief for her struggling family. But that fragile hope is shaken when a group of girls her age recognize her and mock her for working instead of enjoying the festival. Tieu Lac endures their cruel laughter in silence and continues selling. As the sun lowers, a darker threat appears. Two rough young men approach, pretending interest in her candy, then begin harassing her. They take without paying, block her path, and taunt her with growing boldness. Surrounded by a crowded market full of watching strangers, Tieu Lac realizes the most painful truth. Everyone sees her fear, yet no one steps forward to help.